Hello, BookTube. Recently, this channel passed 12.7 thousand subscribers. And when we pass a milestone like that, no matter how ridiculous it is, you all love to ask questions. We love to do Q&As. And I love it too, because the questions are almost never boring. So I put out a call, and I got a ton of questions. So once again, we are going to go through a Q&A. Just keeping in mind, I'm going to cut these videos off at 30 minutes each till we get to the end of the questions. And I ported the questions over from the comments field of the video where I requested them into a document so I could clean it up a little. If in the course of doing that I cut off part of your question or your question entirely, it wasn't intentional, it wasn't censorship. Just try again next time. So we'll start with Shelf Life, who has questions for Frida, which is, for those of you who are new, my little dog who's up on her pillow surveying her kingdom. Although I sometimes suspect that when she's surveying her kingdom, she's actually asleep. But at least now, when she's a little older. Frida, of course, does not understand your questions and wouldn't understand half the concepts that are in them since they're human concepts. I hope you don't mind if I take the liberty of answering for her. No one knows her better than I do. Question number one is, how old are you? Frida is 6. Number 2, cats, yay or nay? She doesn't like anything that registers as prey. So in our neighborhood, we have a few cats who very much do not register as prey. They are big porch cats who sit on their cushions all day long, rain and shine, summer and winter, and brook no insolence from any living animal. Those Frida just ignores. It's the cats who sort of slink and scurry that bother her, and only because they then strike her as prey. She doesn't like things that slink or scurry. Number 3, what's the weirdest thing you've ever eaten? Any human food guilty pleasures? This little dog of mine does not eat anything weird or untoward, and she never has. She just doesn't do it. I had one of my previous 2 dogs. I had a pointer named Malin who ate anything that she could find. Anything. Always. Until literally the last month of her life. Anything off the ground. She would bolt it down before I could stop her, even though she knew I didn't like it. It was the only time she ever willingly disobeyed me, and she couldn't resist the impulse. This dog, you could walk her right by food on the sidewalk and she wouldn't care. I have to bring it to her attention. So nothing. Number 4, have you ever scratched, peed, or otherwise ruined a book? If so, was it Kurt Vonnegut? No, Frida does not randomly destroy things. I mean, when she's a little puppy, she did, because puppies do. And shouldn't be discouraged from doing so. They're exploring the world. They're learning how to calculate their own senses through their teeth, through their mouth, through their tongue, through their taste. But I made allowances for anybody who has a puppy. You should make allowances for that. You're going to lose a lot of stuff. But after that, no, she has no interest in destroying anything except prey. And number 5, what's your favorite toy or game you like to play most? She's an adult dog. She doesn't like to play. I don't teach my dogs to do any kinds of tricks to amuse me. They're not toys, so I don't. And once they're not puppies, I don't. She has no interest in toys. She has no interest in games. She has no interest in anything like that. She likes to hang out and talk. She likes to go on walks. She likes to kill mice. No toys, no games. Bill Rutenberg, congratulations on 12.7. It is well deserved. Is it really? It's a pretty boring channel. Number 1, as a huge Lincoln fan, I'm interested to know what are the top 2 or 3 biographies you would recommend to a person wanting to study Lincoln in depth. Well, there's been so much written on this figure. I think I've recommended to you in the past a Lincoln scholar named Harold Holzer. He's fantastic. He's written a few books on Lincoln. The most famous of one, the one that did the best in terms of money, was a book about Lincoln's relation with the press, with the free press, with the Fourth Estate, which is disturbing and really good. But I recommend everything else. He did a big book on Lincoln during Lincoln's time as candidate-elect for president. So between the time when he was elected and when he took office, you would think there isn't even an article in such a time period, much less a book. And yet, and question number 2, also, where would you rank him in comparison to other presidents and why? I would rank him extremely, extremely high. In the top 5. in the top 5. He kept the country together. During what remains the worst internecine split that the country had ever experienced. He kept it together, and all the men who had ran against him, all the men who were in his cabinet thought they would make better presidents. They would all have done a worse job. They would have done something fatally wrong. It's an incredibly delicate thing, and he managed to do it. Uh, and even with a certain kind of lanky grace. I wouldn't put of the various men who've held this office over the centuries, I wouldn't have put many of them in that position. If you'd said, here's the situation, which of these people do you put in here? There aren't many of them I would have put in there more than him. So he ranks very highly. Literary Gladiators. Oh boy, all the booktubers coming out here. Josh from Literary Gladiators. Two questions. Number one, have you considered putting together an FAQ, a frequently asked questions video, which would include questions that are frequently asked from your Q&A videos? It might even come off as a best of Steve's Q&A. That's actually a really good idea. An FAQ video. I wonder if we should all do that. All of us who've been, like, for instance, all of us who have more than 100 videos, who've been on BookTube more than a year or two, an FAQ video is probably a very good idea. Oh, I'll think about that. Number two, are there any horror fiction authors that you find as possessing merit? Sure. Peter Straub, almost all the time. Clive Barker, quite a bit of the time. Not always, but quite a bit of the time. Dr. Bacon says, thanks for always doing these. Question number one, each year when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, do you take the opportunity to cycle through translations, or do you go back to a specific version each year? I do. I do cycle through translations. For a decade or so, for those of you who don't know what Dr. Bacon is referring to, I read the Iliad every June and the Odyssey every August, and I have for a very, very long time. And I went through a decade or so, maybe more than that, where I would cycle through translations in one of the two, and then read the other in the original. And then the next year I would read the other in the original and cycle through translations of the other one. It took a long time to get through a lot. There are always new translations too. Lately, I have mostly just been sticking to English language translations and trying to appreciate what they are doing as translations. And this year, I'm doing prose. I'm reading both in prose translations for the fun of it. And question number two, do you think the arrest of Ryan Kelly signifies that we may see more people involved with the insurrection, up to and including Trump, also be arrested? No, I do not think that. Chris Dave, a theater critic. Would you consider creating starter kits for the literature of different countries? I'd be very keen to see what you'd include in a French literature starter kit, for example. I would add them to the pile of starter kits. I have been promising for years now to get back to regular starter kits. I haven't done it. It's a great idea. Actively Read says, hey, Steve, absolutely loving these Q&As. Well, I'm glad of that, because I sure have no signs of stopping. Three questions. What are your thoughts on Matthew McConaughey's memoir, Green Lights? I kind of sort of liked it. I thought parts of it were effective. Whoever wrote it did a really good job. Two, are you a fan of the Orphan X series by Greg Hurwitz? Yes, of course. Is anyone who's ever read one of those books not a fan of the series? And three, have you found the perfect e-reader yet in your hunt for one? No. No, I haven't. I am exploring. I'm continuing to explore. I routinely look at YouTube review videos of not only e-readers that are not the big three, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Kobo, but also different e-readers from those manufacturers, different than the ones I have. I am honing in on what are the characteristics of the perfect e-reader for me. And I have to admit, the usage also yields some details in that direction. It's not just a question of looking at these things on spec. It's a question of when it comes time to do a long chunk of reading on a device, what do you grab for? What do you grab for? What are you in the mood for? Let's say you have a pile of e-readers and they're the book that you want to read is on all of them. What do you grab for? I mean to do a video on this, a breakdown of e-readers when the time comes, either here or on a second channel. But I have noticed that I like a device with an unequal bezel so that I have a place to put my hand. I have something to grip on it, which rules out the Amazon Kindle. I also like the Paperwhite. I've also found that I like page turn buttons, which rules out the Paperwhite. Paperwhite's the most popular e-reader in the world, and I often find myself going either to the Kindle Oasis or to the Kobo H2O, which has a cheaper build than the Oasis, but has the page turn buttons and the uneven bezel so that you have a place to grip it. I don't know. I haven't found the perfect one yet. No. The actual form factor that I like the most is the old Kindle or the old Barnes & Noble Simple Touch. just a simple square of a thing with a rubber casing, rubber bezels, and the page turn buttons. And I love reading on that thing. I have two of them now. But I absolutely cannot figure out how the folder partitioning is done on those devices for storage. I had a very old Simple Touch, and I thought it kept telling me you're out of storage. I had barely any books on it, 100 books on it. When I know that it can hold 1,000 or more, and I kept thinking, all right, well, something's wrong here. You're doing something wrong. Then I got another Barnes & Noble Simple Touch that was completely free. They had nothing on it. It was just blank from memory. And I loaded a micro SD card into it at 32 gigs. That should be enough for any amount of books that I want to put on it. And yet, again, at around 100 books, it started telling me you are out of storage. And I checked, and the card is in there. The device does recognize it. I must just not understand how that's working. And at first I thought, well, okay, so what you should do is look at 10 or 12 videos from 10 years ago. This is a 10-year-old device, and find out how you should figure what you're doing wrong and how to work the storage correctly. And then I thought, well, the Kobo and the Kindle handle the storage automatically. I don't have to look at old videos to figure out how that works. They just take as many books as I load onto them because book files are small. And that sort of worked against the Simple Touch. That sort of made me put them away. But anyway, I don't want to make that video now. I am still searching, if that's your question. I am still searching. For instance, I have not yet tried a full iPad-sized e-reader. Don't have one of those. With e-ink. Something the size of what's the one I'm thinking of now? There's one that's really popular. There's a note-taking e-reader, a note-taking e-device. It's not coming to me off the top of my head. It might be an Amazon product, but I have an iPad, but I don't have an iPad-sized device that reads only on e-ink. But anyway, let's see here. CVBN457. Steve, I've heard several booktubers, including yourself, talk about the importance of deep reading. However, I haven't seen a good how-to on the topic. I think you are the man for the job. What does it mean to read deeply? How does one do it? This may be a topic for a video on its own, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm not sure that I've talked much about deep reading. It just means paying super close attention. What is going on here? Down in the bowels of the thing. What is this book doing? As opposed to the way that a lot of people read. A lot of people read books for what happens next. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's an essential talent of an author. If they let that part of it down, they're failing. But deep reading would be, how does something on page 250 relate to something on page 15? And how do both those pages relate to everything else the author's written? Something like that. It isn't the kind of reading a lot of people do. Usually the people that I know do it are critics. And even then, it's usually unnecessary because usually your readers, even if you're a critic, only really want to know about the stuff they are going to care about. Are the characters well drawn? Is the pacing good? Does the author forget things? In other words, many different aspects of what happens next. But I should do a whole video on it. That would be fun. KMM says, number one, in one of Steve Dream's bel canto opera came up, and I asked Donizetti or Bellini. At the time, you said Donizetti. What is your favorite Donizetti opera? Oh, my. That would be really hard. That would be really hard. Anna Bolena, for instance, is great. Maria Sturata is great. Lucia d'Almamor is probably the answer you would get from most people would be Lucia d'Almamor. And I don't know on any given day and any given performance which one of those would be my favorite. Number two, also in the Steve Dreams, the Pikesville Barnes & Noble is getting a reputation. That is my closest chain bookstore here in Maryland. You're kidding me. The Pikesville Barnes & Noble is your Barnes & Noble. It seems to be thriving. Yeah, that's how it originally came up on Steve Stream, which I realize I haven't done in a while. Apologies for that. That's how it originally came up, is that I talked about my Barnes & Noble here in Boston going out of business, and people were singing out in the comments field about how their Barnes & Nobles were doing. But anyway, do you remember anything to share about your travels through Maryland? Oh, Lord, yes, I do. Very much so. Far more stories than I could say in a Q&A. I used to have a job in Washington, D.C. I was very familiar with lots of Merrill. Flora should be reading. Hi, Steve. Congrats on reaching another influencer goal. My questions. Number one, what do you think of the novel Exciting Times by Nausi Dolan? I didn't. Well, what do you think? I've seen it's received praise, but I'm struggling with its sardonic, deadpan writing style that's so popular nowadays. Yeah, yeah, I hate to say it, but I thought it was inept. I mean, I know there was something going on. I'm pretty sure what the author was trying to do in the book. I don't think it was done well. I don't think anything in it was done well. I think it was just inept. And when I was reading, I kept thinking, okay, why didn't anybody along the production chain line, the author, the author's best friend, the author's writing group, the author's agent, the author's editor, the house's editor, why didn't anyone catch this? Why didn't anyone question this? And the more I read about it, and afterwards, the more I thought was that, I mean, the ideas behind the book have a certain inherent interest, but it's so poorly executed. And I kept asking myself why, and the answer kept coming back. It's so poorly executed because we live in the era of my truth. So if you do something crappy, you can say, well, this is my version of good. And I guess the attitude now is that since we respect any kind of cotton picking nonsense that comes out of anyone's mouth, that no one would contradict that and say, well, no, objectively has become the foremost curse word of our time. And if that is true, you're going to get books like this. Anyway, number two, what did you think of Curtis Sittenfeld's Rodham novel? I'm curious to read it, but I'm not sure if it's worth it. It's very much worth it. Talk about the opposite example. It's very, very good. And number three, last but not least, what did you think of the novel Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas? At first, I was slightly annoyed by the style, but the author eventually won me over. We'll see. It's another example of what I mean. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read the book, but the organizing principle, the premise, the forward movement of Catherine House is fantastic. I just didn't think it was done well. So by the end of the book, the thing I was clinging to was the premise, which shouldn't be true. I might cling to the premise of a book at the beginning of any book. Sure, a bounty hunter who's on the run from other bounty hunters. A star-spanning civilization that is collapsing. Sure, the premise will keep me going for a while in any book, but if I'm getting to the end of the book and I'm still saying only, gee, what a good premise this is, the author hasn't... I agree. I hear what you're saying when you say the author eventually won me over. The premise kept me going. I think that's my version of the author eventually won me over, but... I view both the books you mentioned here, in between, the Rodham sandwich here, I view both of them as pure examples of what happens when an editor can no longer hand a manuscript back to an author and say, fix this. And editors absolutely cannot do that now. Anyway, I'd love to pick your brain about every novel under the sun. Well, you've got my email. Feel free. Sean D. says, here's a question, Steve. If someone was to slip a novel into your coffin before it is screwed shut, what would you like it to be? Well, A, that's an odd question for someone who's a raven-haired, bee-sting-lipped, snub-nosed, 8-pack abs 28-year-old. A long way from anyone screwing my coffin shut. And besides, cremation. Right? So, cremation. So, there won't be a coffin. And why would I want a book screwed into a coffin with me anyway? I'm not there. What do I care? You can screw in anything you want. The Rambling Reviewer says, hey, Steve, I'm reading through Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy right now. I know you like some of the volumes he's edited. What do you think of his writing? I do like his writing. I do like his writing. I get the strong impression that he waits till the end of his contract to write his books. So I'm kind of wishing that he wouldn't do that. If I'm right about that, then there's a masterpiece that he hasn't written because he just doesn't give himself the time to write a draft and then ruminate on it, pick it, poke it, and then write it again, and then ruminate on that. I think that's the reason why he hasn't written a great science fiction book. He easily could. The talent is obviously there. Anyway, also, do you like any other weird fiction / cosmic horror writers? What about Alternate Blackwood? I know that I should. I know that some of them are good, but cosmic horror just doesn't do it for me. Also, I saw the new Jurassic Park. So do you have a favorite dinosaur? Of course I have a favorite dinosaur. It is the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Also, what's some of the best vegan food in Boston? The best vegan food in Boston is the best vegan food anywhere, and that is Mega Stuff Oreos. Oh my God. Minia Petrinu? O'Brien will do it. I follow it up right away. All right. O'Brien wants to know, and one would think you would remember well enough what a crush the 18th century Grosvenor Square was to stop relentlessly marching towards 13,000. Now you've often described the New York Review of Books as the best. Not once have I ever said that. Yet over the past few years, I've often found myself thinking that the LRB, that is the London Review of Books, has managed to do a better job both in comparison to the NYRB and the TLS. I am referring to the quality of the reviews when comparing for a specific book and the quality of the overall coverage. Well, I'd assume that's what you're referring to, but you're wrong. Meanwhile, the TLS especially seems plagued by book reports. Would you agree? And what are your thoughts on how these three publications acquit themselves of late? The TLS has had, I admit, they've had a visible editorial shift. I'm not talking about names on the masthead here. I'm saying you can look at the publication and see that some editorial ideology has changed. But I don't see many book reports in the TLS. I think the editorial cadre that's in place there specifically watches out for that to make sure that isn't true. What O'Brien here is referring to, those of you who might not know, is the difference between a book report and a book review. A book review will be artfully done. It will have a personality. It will have a voice. It won't just run down the book. Pros and cons, metric weight, that sort of thing. And bad book review journals will often run book reports, just to say they weighed in on the book. I've never seen the point of it. The LRB certainly doesn't do it. The New York Review of Books doesn't do it, usually. And the TLS, I don't think they do. I don't see it myself. Let's see here. P.S. The LRB blog would be the perfect place for you to keep a weekly column. I think there are a few editorial strings attached. Though you think there are few editorial strings attached. I entirely agree. Is it in your gift? I would love to do it. But there would have to be no editorial strings attached except length. And I don't think that would happen. They haven't exactly come knocking at my door. I have a book column of my own, but I would love to do that. I agree. But with a book review for a book section editor who knows what they want in their section, they know the tone of the reviews, the tone of their coverage, for something like that, I am content to trim my sails and sail by their heading. Absolutely. I am a book section editor myself. I have been in the past. That's important. Don't argue with your editor. But a column is a different thing. I wouldn't accept interference in a column. And I think the LRB would probably want to interfere in a column, so I don't think that's ever going to happen. CVBN457 here again. Steve, one genre I've neglected is fantasy. I, of course, enjoy Lord of the Rings. The only other fantasy novels I really enjoyed are the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. The protagonist reminds me of Peter Parker in that he has limitations to his power and has to contend with the real-world problems along the way. What is your opinion of the Dresden Files? I would second your opinion. They're quite enjoyable. I am somewhat tempted to go back to the first one and start reading again because my old friend Deb is reading them, and so it comes up in conversation. But I don't know that they're worth rereading, at least for me. Leo Percara says, "Hello, Steve. I'm reading Lonesome Dove for The Thing." The Thing could be either one of two things here. It could be that Matthew at Mayberry Book Club and I are doing a read-along of Lonesome Dove, or it could be Michael K. Vaughan's event, June on the Range. But are the sequels and prequels, including the miniseries of all of them, good to continue reading / watching? No, they are not. No. The prequels, I'm not talking about the miniseries here, but the prequels and sequels are not worth reading. It really bothers me that when publishers hitch extremely derivative third-rate stuff like that to the book that keeps them going, especially in a numbered sequence, where it'll just be, here's where the story starts. In what, Dead Man Walking, I think? Here's where the story starts. So there'll be a number of 3 just plastered on Lonesome Dove. Lonesome Dove is not third in a series. Lonesome Dove is alone in a series. It's alone in a series. It's a standalone book. And when it became hugely popular, enormously popular, iconically popular, and then when the miniseries became iconically popular, so people loving it more than any author could anticipate. Larry McMurtry felt resentful and decided to use the sequels and prequels to take out his resentment on his characters. In the prequels, they are degraded, tortured, run down. In the sequels, they are degraded, tortured, murdered, casually, out of hand, in stupid ways. It is one of the worst, most noticeable examples I've ever seen of an author desecrating their own legacy simply to spite the fans. So no, I don't encourage reading them at all. They are certainly not necessary to read Lonesome Dove. And also, have you ever met someone that lived in the kind of hard environment that that novel presents? Well, not quite that hard, no, but I have, when I was camping and hiking all over the American West, I did meet cowboys. I met actual cowboys, people who cattle ranchers, who still spend all day in the saddle, literally spend all day in the saddle, who live basically that kind of life. They all had cell phones, or had telephones at home. They all had TV and cable dishes or whatnot. But they did live still that kind of a life. I got to know a couple of those quite well. But I don't think they'd have had much trouble adapting to 100 years earlier. How are we doing for time? We've got fine. Caleb Bouchard says, "Hi, Steve. You've mentioned that you've taught literature in the past. Off the top of your head, would you share a favorite teaching moment? What were some of your favorite authors / books, to teach?" Favorite book was undoubtedly, I would mix mythology, great works from mythology, with the Old and New Testament. I would have a discussion first. The whole class would have a discussion first, so I would say, this was in days before students would record the teacher and get them sued, get them fired, get them impoverished, get them put in jail, get them attacked in their homes. This is before any of that, the barbarity of the 21st century. I would have a discussion first, and I would say, the fact that we're going to read these together is because they come from the same time period, they're born of the same literary urges, they met the same readership needs. I am not attacking your faith. Your faith has to be separate from these written documents. Obviously it does. Obviously it does. It has to be separate from them because these written documents are in museums. They're studied by atheists and Muslims and Buddhists all day long, every day. So your faith has to be separate from them. They don't glow in the dark. I'm trusting that your faith is separate from them, so we're going to talk about them in context of the literature of the time. I loved how those conversations went. Loved how it did. And occasionally I would stop that session or a later session and actually take a student aside and say, well, I know that you're a fervently believing Christian. I know your faith means a lot to you. Are you doing okay? And invariably, those students would say, yes, this is fantastic. I know you're not attacking my faith, and neither is anyone in this class. I wouldn't put up with it. So I'm learning a lot. Please keep going. You're not bothering me at all. That would also count as favorite teaching moments. But we're gonna stop here and come back for part 2.